You've seen the movies, right? The intense firefights in the jungle, the helicopters, the iconic music. But the Vietnam War was so much more than a Hollywood blockbuster. It was a conflict that spanned decades, tore nations apart, and left scars that are still healing today. So what was it really all about? Let's rewind. It didn't just start in the 60s. For a long time, Vietnam was under French colonial rule. After World War II, a powerful independence movement led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces rose up. They wanted freedom. They fought the French, and in a stunning victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, they won. But the world was in the grip of the Cold War. The United States, terrified of the domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow, couldn't just let Vietnam become a unified communist state. So the Geneva Accords split the country in two. The communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South, backed by the United States. The plan was to hold an election to reunify the country in 2 years. Spoiler alert, that election never happened. The South, fearing a communist victory, refused. And that's when things really started to escalate. The North supported a communist insurgency in the South, known as the Viet Cong. The U.S. poured money, weapons, and military advisors into the South to prop up its government. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. It was a reported attack on a U.S. destroyer. Whether it actually happened the way it was portrayed is still heavily debated, but it was the excuse Washington needed. It gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the green light to send in the first U.S. combat troops. And just like that, America was officially at war. What followed was a nightmare. This wasn't a war of front lines and clear-cut battles. It was a guerrilla war fought in dense jungles, rice paddies, and civilian villages. American soldiers, most of them young draftees, were fighting an enemy they could rarely see, in a place they didn't understand. The Viet Cong used tunnels, booby traps, and surprise attacks with brutal efficiency. The U.S. responded with overwhelming firepower. Operation Rolling Thunder dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped in all of World War II. They used chemical agents like Agent Orange to strip the jungle of its leaves, exposing enemy positions, but also causing devastating health problems for decades to come, for both Vietnamese civilians and American soldiers. Back home, America was being torn apart. For the first time, people saw the brutal reality of war on their television screens every night. The anti-war movement exploded. Protests, marches, a generation questioning its government. The famous Tet Offensive in 1968 was a military disaster for the North, but a massive psychological victory. It showed Americans that despite what they were being told, the war was far from over. Finally, after years of brutal fighting, massive casualties on all sides, and immense political pressure, the U.S. began to withdraw. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, but the peace didn't last. 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnamese forces rolled into the southern capital, Saigon. The war was over. Vietnam was finally unified, but under communist rule. The cost was staggering. Millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians dead. Over 58,000 American lives lost. The war left deep wounds on the American psyche and changed the way a generation viewed its government and the world. It was a conflict born from colonialism, fueled by the Cold War, and defined by a brutal, confusing, and ultimately tragic struggle in the jungles of Southeast Asia.